welcome to the latest edition of LexisNexis Risk Solutions Facing Change series. I'm Mike Harris, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Justine Walker. Justine is Head of Global Sanctions and Risk at ACAMS, that's the Association of Anti-Money Laundering Specialists. Justine, welcome. Thank you for joining us today. Well, so let's start by talking about the sanctions landscape. It's evolving continuously, but probably never more so than now. And really the question I've got is, has managing sanctions risk become almost impossibly complex and challenging given the current situation?
I've seen just a huge growth in particularly US sanctions over recent years. But we've also seen different players becoming more important. I mean, the role of Congress has really become to the forefront now in shaping sanctions dialogue and setting the tone for future sanctions. Treasury OFAC have always been there. State Department's always been there. But we're also seeing biz and even commerce, when you look at the recent TikTok, WeChat announcements, they're becoming more important, as is the Coast Guard when you look at the maritime side. So we have more players with more views. And, what does that mean for firms? It means that I think they need to take a much wider horizon look at the risks and looking at their indirect exposure, because this is something we are seeing really escalated over recent years, is people having to consider indirect risk or third country risk. So they may not be doing business directly with Iran or with Cuba or with North Korea, but their partners somewhere in the chain may be doing that. So it's having a much clearer view of the whole set of relationships that you're engaged with and the risk of those relationships, whether it be supplier relationships, whether it be correspondent relationships. We also have the reputational risk, as we've all seen recently with the FinCEN leaks. There are many different aspects at play here.
We've seen specifically with China and Russia a new genre of human rights abuse sanctions coming out, the so-called Magnitsky-style sanctions being applied in the US and very recently in the UK in particular. Could you tell us more about that and what do you think we're likely to be seeing going forward?
We've had many, many sanctions over the years which have stemmed from concerns over human rights abuses. I think what is most evident now is that is much more front and center, and states are taking they're articulating their position stronger and their willingness to use these type of sanctions. I mean, we certainly see that in the case of the UK. In the post-Brexit environment, it's very clear that human rights sanctions will be a very strong feature. As you say, the US, we've seen that. What I think is maybe different to what we had noted over recent years is the willingness to apply these sanctions to other major superpowers.
Kind of touched on my next question a little bit already. We've seen a lot of significant policy divergence between the US and Europe, particularly, and now the UK as it comes out of the EU. With this sense of growing divergence and this issue emerging more prominently, and the challenges that it poses for sanctions compliance teams, what's your take on that whole situation, and what should we be doing about it?
So I think it's just worthwhile just to put this into context. I mean, secondary sanctions are sanctions. I mean, the US sanctions imposed on non-US actors. So there's no involvement with the US financial system. But those individuals then are prohibited from accessing the US financial system. And I think what this really means is that we see people who maybe think they have no US nexus, they think what they're doing is perfectly legal within their own jurisdictions, and then they suddenly get caught out. And a good example of that is the COSCO shipping lines, where we had some sub-entities designated a while ago now in relation to Iranian transactions. Now, those transactions were perfectly legitimate under the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, but they were not permitted under the US framework. So there we're starting to see non-US actors having to manage their US exposure in a way that they didn't have to think about over recent years. And this is growing.
So let's just turn our attention to global trade for a moment. We've seen an increased focus from the sanctioning authorities, particularly the US once again, on non-financial service companies, i.e. corporates for want of a better term. Do you think this is indicative of a shifting global political balance that's going on?
I think one of the things I would say is that 2/3 of last year's OFAC public enforcement announcements were to non-financial institutions. So those entities in the front line of sanctions have extended out considerably beyond financial institutions. I mean, financial institutions still carry the weight of the fines, but other types of organizations, whether it's maritime, whether it's the tech sector, whether it's energy, are much more in scope around their role in potential sanctions evasion or facilitation. And I do think that it is going to be the role of corporates, the role of maritime sector, the energy companies is going to remain very high profile over the next few years.
You know, it's almost impossible to talk about sanctions without getting involved in politics. Two major political events happening this year, of course, the US elections coming up in November, and of course, the B word, Brexit, inevitably on all our lips, and how that's unfolding right now. Just how do you think these events are going to impact the sanctions landscape this year and perhaps into next year?
Well, first of all, sanctions is a foreign policy tool. So it is geopolitics is really what it's all about. So you have to be following the politics to understand sanctions. What I would say is that ahead of every US election, people go into a bit of a wait and see mode. You look to see, well, who's going to come in, what is going to happen. But whatever happens, sanctions are here. And I think one of the things which slightly concerns me at times, people feel that if there's a change of administration, we'll suddenly see lots of sanctions regimes fall away. That will not be the case. What I would say on Brexit is, we are moving into a new framework in that there is going to be a new player on the block in the world of sanctions. And people will have to look at their exposure to the US regime, to the EU regime, to the UK regime, as well as other autonomous regimes, such as whether it's Australia or Canada. But we are, with the fact that the UK does have a global financial centre, it's very prominent, its footprint globally financially is very large. That regime will be very important. But, there will be changes. We'll see a new administrative list. We'll see administrative changes. People will have to prepare for that.
Finally, Justine, if you were to step on the bridge and have a look out, a difficult question, big question, if you like, over the next few years, what advice would you have for sanctions compliance teams? What would you say they really need to get to grips with?
So I think it really comes back to some of my earlier answers to your questions, and that is about we're seeing a lot more indirect exposure. We're seeing a lot more of grey areas between what is permissible and what is prohibited. And people are having to make judgment calls much more around ownership and control factors, whether something is permissible or not. So for me, it is going to be around how do you, as an institution, ensure that you are a thinking institution and you're able to really risk assess in a meaningful way, record that and articulate that if you ever need to regulators on the decisions that you make. And it is also going to become increasingly difficult just to say, no, I'm not doing that because there's a sanctions risk. What we're seeing in the growth of China sanctions, the Russia aspects, there is going to be many cross-border conflicts on sanctions compliance, and people are going to have to navigate that and have to look at how they manage those relationships, whether it be in the energy sector, the maritime sector, global trade, exporters. So it is. I think actually we're in a pretty unique period of time, and there's going to be many game-changing elements as we move forwards.